This one comes out, right? Thank you very much, Byron. Is this sounding good? Okay. One of the reasons I'm dressed the way I am, with the long sleeves and the long pants, is because I'm going to go over across the street to the Children's Hospital after this is finished and spend the night with my grandson, who's 14 years old and who is undergoing some very tough therapy for cancer. He had his left kidney removed and it's gone to his lungs. Now they're trying to knock it out of his lungs, and in the process of doing that, they really have to use his body as a battlefield, as it were, and kill the stem cells. They had to give him bone marrow transplant to get things rejuvenated. And what's this all about? The reason I mention it is not only because this is where my mind is and where my heart is tonight, but also because I think it really is a symbol of what we're talking about. It's necessary to eradicate every last cancer cell. It's not enough to cut them in half or to reduce them or to make progress. You've got to get rid of every last cancer cell. And to do that, they have to really give his lungs a dose that's going to leave permanent scarring on his lungs. But hopefully, it's going to get rid of those cancer cells. There's no guarantee of success. But what alternative is there? Well, in a similar way, I think that we have to look at nuclear weapons, and I believe nuclear technology in terms of uranium-based reactor technology in the same way. That's my belief. And many other people have come to share this belief. In fact, after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, many people were shocked into realizing that the world had undergone a fundamental change. Albert Einstein is famously quoted as saying, "The splitting of the atom has changed everything except man's way of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe." You may not know it, but within a month and a half of the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, there was a joint statement issued in Washington, D.C. by the leaders of the three countries involved in the Manhattan Project, which were Canada, the United Kingdom, and the USA, saying that they recognized that this weapon had fundamentally transformed the world, and that against this weapon there was no defense, and that the only possibility was to eliminate completely the destructive uses of nuclear weapons. So I think that we, over the years, have tended to forget the fact that this really is an urgent threat to all of humanity, and in fact to more than humanity, to life on Earth. So because it's Hiroshima Day, I'm going to spend most of my talk, at the beginning at least, talking about that, and I will, however, mention some things here in Quebec that I think deserve a lot more attention by journalists. And I think that journalists have difficulty dealing with these issues, partly because they feel they don't have sufficient background. I'd just like to point out to journalists that there is a whole network of educated people who are outside the nuclear establishment, outside government and industry, who do have expertise and knowledge on the subject, and that these people are generally available for consultation to add balance and to give perspective to your stories. And I would certainly like to make a two-way offer. On the one hand, I offer my services to anybody who's doing a story of that sort. I frequently talk to journalists and just point them in certain directions, point them to certain documents, point out a few facts that they can verify, whatever. But it's also a two-way street. I'd really appreciate help from journalists in helping to advise me and my friends as to how better to get our message out in the public domain, how to use the media, because the journalism is not only a profession, but it's an institution of democracy. And it's really so vital. Freedom of the press, we sort of take it for granted, but it's so vital to really have that freedom of the press to talk about important issues. And unfortunately, some of the most important issues of all tend to get ignored. So, without further ado, I'd just like to mention some Quebec issues of importance that I'd be glad to discuss with any of you. First of all, there's a crisis regarding uranium mining in Quebec, of which there is none at the present time, but there is very extensive and aggressive exploration going on in Cree country, up in Mistissini. That's the most advanced project that is currently underway under exploration, advanced exploration. There's also the North Shore up near Sept-Îles, and you may have heard about the 30 medical doctors who signed a letter to the Minister of Environment here in Quebec saying that they will leave the community and possibly leave the province unless the province passes a moratorium on uranium mining, because they don't want to face the medical, they don't want to deal with the medical consequences of mining this very dangerous material. Many people have come to the point of view that there are two substances which are too dangerous to mine. And one of those is asbestos, and the other one is uranium. And in fact, just September of the year before last, September 2010, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War passed a unanimous resolution saying that they are in favor of banning uranium mining around the world. Pretty strong statement, especially coming from medical doctors. The other issue is the only nuclear reactor in Quebec is the Gentil 2 nuclear reactor located at Bécancour, and Hydro-Quebec is under pressure from its nuclear division to refurbish this reactor, which means pulling out the old radioactive degraded tubes and replacing them with new tubes so that they can keep this geriatric plant running for another 20 or 30 years. The price of this has been escalating. It started off less than $1 billion. When it was announced, it was $2 billion. Now it's admitted to be $3 billion and still climbing, which makes the price of the electricity really not worth it. Nevertheless, Jean Charest in particular has pointed out that he would still is inclined to favor this because of the jobs involved, neglecting the fact that the alternatives, renewables, not only renewables and energy efficiency throughout the province. Imagine spending $2 or $3 billion on energy efficiency projects. The jobs would be 10 times as many jobs. And also, the dismantlement of the structures, the radioactive structures at Gentil, would actually be safer jobs for the workers and would provide employment for decades to come. So in fact, you know, this is a debate. It's an important debate, and it's going to be settled this year, and yet in the English press, very little has been said about it. Certainly very little in any depth. In the French press, there's been a great deal more. And then we have the question of nuclear waste. Nuclear waste is really the issue that is, I've said to various groups in this last year that the age of nuclear power is virtually over, and we're now really well launched into the age of nuclear waste. In fact, even the nuclear industry is beginning to see that's where the jobs are, nuclear waste. And they're realizing that there's billions of dollars being spent on managing these nuclear waste, and because the waste is perpetual, the jobs, I suppose, also have a high degree of permanence. There's the high-level waste, which is the irradiated fuel. Premier Robert Bourassa, when he was premier, he declared, because of the fact that the U.S. Department of Energy wanted to put a waste repository just south of the eastern townships in Vermont, he declared that Quebec would never allow a permanent repository for nuclear waste in the territory of Quebec or on its borders. And that has never been challenged by any other politician in Quebec. More recently, the National Assembly, about a year ago, passed a resolution saying that there's no way that they would countenance the import of nuclear waste into Quebec for permanent storage from other provinces. The reason this is important is because Canada, federally, is now looking for a single repository to put all of Canada's nuclear waste. And the people who are being targeted for this are often Aboriginal communities in northern Saskatchewan. oftentimes very poor, impoverished communities which have very little in the way of economic opportunity. And they're being told that this is a great deal for them, that they can get jobs, they can get economic development, and they can get the nuclear waste. So these are issues that are very important. But I'd like to respect the fact here that we're talking on the anniversary. The anniversary I think of as a happy time, let's just say commemoration of that awful event, which, if there is such a thing as terrorism, I don't know what else you can call it but terrorism. I mean, talk about collateral damage. You know, a whole city full of men, women, and children being incinerated and fried with radiation. This really is a terrible act. I mean, however you slice it, and wherever the justification might be. It's something to think about. And this is a model of the uranium atom. It's an enlarged model of the uranium atom taken by my friend Robert Del Tredici, who often works with me. It's at the Oak Ridge site in Tennessee where they enriched the uranium for the Hiroshima bomb. The enriched uranium that went into the Hiroshima bomb was from this place. And that's a model of the uranium atom. Uranium is the key element of all nuclear technology, whether military or civilian. Without uranium, none of it would exist. There wouldn't be a single nuclear weapon in the world if it wasn't for uranium. And all nuclear reactors are fueled with uranium or with the uranium derivative. Now, here we have a picture taken in 1943 in Quebec City. On the extreme left, we have Prime Minister Mackenzie King. In the middle, we have President Roosevelt. And on the right, we have Winston Churchill. And they are there to sign an accord called the Quebec Accord, which was an agreement for the three nations to cooperate in building the world's first atomic bombs. And the reason why Canada was involved in this is because we had the uranium. And that uranium was conveniently provided to the Allies as a wartime endeavor, quite gladly by Canada. And in fact, much after the war, at the end of the war, all of the uranium mined in Canada up until 1970 was all for military purposes. It all went into nuclear weapons. And in 1959, for example, uranium was the fourth most important export from Canada. After pulp and paper, timber, and wheat came uranium. And it was all for nuclear weapons. There was no other market at that time. In 1975, did I say 1970? It goes beyond that. It goes up past 1975. Prime Minister, gosh, I'm having a blackout here. Sorry? No.
Trudeau?
I'm sorry, I have a real trouble with names sometimes.
Pierre Trudeau?
The guy before Trudeau.
Pearson.
Prime Minister Pearson, imagine forgetting him. Prime Minister Pearson declared that henceforth all uranium from Canada will be sold for peaceful purposes only. But that was only after that time. And that was, by the way, after the military contracts had dried up and expired. Now, these are two models. These pictures are also by Robert Del Tredici. These are two models of the first two atomic bombs that were produced and dropped on Japan. The one in the foreground is called Little Boy, and that was the one made from highly enriched uranium that was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. And the other is called Fat Man, and it was made with plutonium and was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Now, plutonium would not exist except for uranium, because in fact plutonium is a transmutation of uranium. Plutonium doesn't exist in nature at all. It is produced by putting uranium into a nuclear reactor, whereupon some of the uranium atoms are transmuted into plutonium. So plutonium is also another form, you might say, of uranium. And here's a picture of Hiroshima in 1945, and this picture has haunted many people. because they can imagine their own cities looking like this. They can imagine all the cities in the world being reduced to rubble like this. It's astonishing to realize that one single Trident submarine has enough warheads on it to do this to every single major city in the Northern Hemisphere. One submarine has enough warheads to do that. So it's very incredible to think about. But there's something else about, besides the explosive, destructive power of the bomb, there's also this enormous heat. As a matter of fact, it's the heat that really creates the explosion. But this is a bronze statue of Buddha, which was partially melted by the heat wave from the fireball at Hiroshima. And Robert took this picture because he thought it really symbolized even the gods are not immune from this. Not that Buddha is a god. But if you explode a 300 kiloton weapon, for example, which is much larger than the Hiroshima bomb, it forms a fireball 2.5 kilometers in diameter. The temperatures at the center of the fireball are 4 times hotter than at the center of the sun, and the heat from the fireball will ignite fires over an area of 105 to 170 square kilometers. So what you do is you get enormous raging fires, a firestorm created by the nuclear blast. That's only one solitary nuclear weapon. In a future nuclear war where both sides had nuclear weapons, there would be many such nuclear firestorms, and there would be many exchanges of nuclear weapons. We haven't had that situation. Nobody has had a conflict where both sides have nuclear weapons and we're prepared to use them. Sorry, I'm not used to this. Let me just move this over here, maybe. There, that's better. Now, why is it called Little Boy? You think, wow, with a power like that. Well, it's really little when you compare it to the equivalent. Because the largest conventional bomb is about 44 tons of TNT equivalent. The Hiroshima bomb was equivalent to about 15,000 tons of TNT, 15 megatons they call it, and kilotons, kilotons. But they now have weapons that go up to 100 megatons. Huge, huge weapons. As a matter of fact, the Hiroshima bomb is now regarded as a very small bomb, and they hardly make bombs that small anymore. There are some tactical nuclear weapons which are smaller, but all of the strategic nuclear weapons are much larger, much more powerful. Even the nuclear weapons that they plan to put in the nose cones of the cruise missiles, even those are about 15 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. So we really have, here's a 15 megaton nuclear test in the South Pacific. The height of the cloud is 12 miles, the diameter of the cloud is 60 miles, and this bomb is about 1,000 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb. 1,000 times more powerful, that is. Take a look at this. That dot, that round dot, second one, is World War II. It's all the firepower that was exhausted during World War II, including the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And beside it, we have that red ball, 395 times the firepower of World War II. Those are the nuclear weapons in the US and Russia which are on high alert. High alert means ready to fire very quickly and with very short notice. If you look at all the deployed weapons that could be sent off in very short order, really, but not the high alert weapons, we have the big blue ball. On the very left there, you notice on the very left I have 1/2 of World War II. That would be what would happen, just for comparison, if, God forbid, we should have hostilities between India and Pakistan, both having nuclear weapons. If they both used a few dozen nuclear weapons on each side, then you could have maybe 100 altogether. Hiroshima-sized, small atomic bombs. And that would be about 1/2 of the firepower of World War II. So what are these high alert nuclear weapons? Well, they're missiles that can be deployed very quickly. They can't be recalled. And once they're fired, they're on their way, and there's no way you can get them back again or stop them or intercept them really well. They're trying to build interceptions, but they're very leaky and not very reliable. They require about 30 minutes or less to reach their targets. There's about 1,900 warheads that fall into this category at the present time. They're all on high alert. There have been resolutions from the General Assembly to at least take them off high alert, which have not been heeded. So those weapons are still on high alert. And with the latest maneuvers of the U.S. government to put, against the objections of the Russians, to put missile defenses into Europe, they're thinking of putting more of them on high alert. The Russians are. There's approximately 130 submarine-based ballistic missiles with about 670 warheads. And by the way, there was a big political furor just last year about the fact that Germany has supplied Israel with nuclear submarines which are nuclear weapons capable. Because having the submarines means that even if the mainland is hit with nuclear weapons, you can still retaliate. So your last gasp can still be a deadly one. And why are nuclear weapons on high alert? Well, I guess it's pretty obvious. It's to launch a retaliatory nuclear strike before the perceived nuclear attack even arrives. So while the missiles are in the air, you want to be able to get these things off. The high alert nuclear weapons facilitate the policy of launch on warning, and the dangers, of course, of that are pretty evident. It means you only have 30 minutes to decide whether you're going to have an all-out nuclear war or not. The U.S. president is, for example, given about 30 seconds briefing and is allowed about 12 minutes to decide whether or not to launch. So that's the kind of pressure we're talking about here. False warning believed to be a real attack. If there is a false warning, which is really believed to be a real attack, then of course you have the danger of accidental nuclear war. And this is much exacerbated when you have nuclear weapons in Europe with Russia because the distance is so much shorter and therefore the warning time is so much less. And even more so when you have India and Pakistan right side by side, shoulder to shoulder. What kind of warning time do you have? There's also the danger that some terrorist group could get a nuclear weapon and explode it. As some U.S. presidential advisor once said, we could wake up and find Washington, D.C. gone and not even know who did it. But if it was suspected that it was somebody who did it and you wanted to retaliate, who are you going to retaliate against? And if you do retaliate, then what? Et cetera, et cetera. So it's really a scary thing. False warning could be due to human error. A technical glitch, there have been such things. They've actually had radar screen glitches where they've actually thought there was an attack. And terrorist sabotage. Here's again, I'm sorry if this is, excuse the word, overkill, but that central dot represents again all of the firepower of World War II, and here's a visual representation of the firepower of all the deployed nuclear weapons. The one with the red background are those on high alert. So you can see what we have prepared, what kind of Armageddon we've prepared for ourselves. The global implications of this, well, among the global implications of this, in addition to the destruction of cities, is the climatic consequences. And I'd like to point this out because nuclear warfare is also a climate change issue, except the climate has changed extremely fast. The methodology of this research, it comes from comprehensive peer-reviewed studies, 10-year simulations, and it uses the NASA climate model, which is the same model they use for climate change generally. And the primary findings are that less than 1% of the global nuclear arsenals, if they were detonated in large cities, would cause catastrophic disruptions of the global climate caused by massive destruction of the ozone layer. Due to these climatic consequences, a large nuclear war, even a preemptive strike, in other words, even if one side got away with it, of just bombing the hell out of the other side, it wouldn't make much difference because although the cities would not be destroyed, the climate would. And again, how does nuclear war cause climate change? Well, it's because when you have nuclear detonations in cities, you get these mass fires which are ignited. And nowadays we have a lot more combustible materials, all the petroleum products and all the high energy materials. millions of tons of smoke rises and remains in the stratosphere for years. Because of the fireball, it goes very, very high, much higher than it would from most volcanoes. And the result is that it doesn't settle out as rapidly as it would from a volcanic eruption, for example. And you get this nuclear darkness, which used to be described as nuclear winter. How many people have heard the phrase nuclear winter? Yeah, well, that's really one of the biggest, most important side effects of nuclear war that just shows you how insane. You know, we shouldn't even call these things weapons, because they're not weapons, they're suicide machines. When it comes to an actual war, they're really suicide machines. A weapon is something that helps you win and prevail, however immorally, over your opponent. This doesn't really help you to prevail. Now, if we talk about a regional or limited nuclear war, just as an example, suppose we think of the possibility of a regional conflict which uses only a few dozen nuclear weapons on each side. So let's say an India-Pakistan conflict. Then here's what would happen. If we use 100 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons, the real small ones, we get about 5 million tons of smoke, which would rise about 50 kilometers above the cloud level into the stratosphere. The global temperatures would drop to what I call the Little Ice Age levels. If you look back and Google it on the internet, you'll find out what the Little Ice Age is. Significant reduction in precipitation. 25 to 40% of the ozone would be destroyed in the mid-latitudes and 50 to 70% destroyed in the northern latitudes. This is a kind of a mock-up of how the smoke spreads over the northern hemisphere day by day. You see the counter in the upper right-hand corner, which is counting off the days. And it just blankets the northern hemisphere. Now this is from a very limited nuclear war, but the point is everyone in the northern hemisphere would suffer consequences from this. Here's the change in average surface temperatures 2 years after this hypothetical India-Pakistan nuclear clash. And you'll notice, if you look at the Canada part of the map, you'll notice temperatures of 2 degrees below normal, 4 degrees below normal, 3 degrees below normal, and so on. Some of them are only half a degree below normal, but we're talking about, this is 2 years after the nuclear conflict. So we're talking about very significant changes in temperature. If you look at the Canadian wheat production after small drops in average surface temperature, this is what comes out of it. The present area where wheat is grown is indicated by that checkered region. A 1 degree Celsius drop in temperature would diminish the crop significantly down to that heavier checkerboard. And a 2 degree Celsius drop would give us very limited wheat production. So we're talking here about very severe global consequences. In 1816, they talked about the year without summer. And the cause of this was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history in Indonesia. There were major crop failures and famine in Europe that time because of the soot and the volcanic ash that just permeated the atmosphere as a result of this huge eruption. The 1816 cooling lasted 1 year, but the cooling from the nuclear war will last many years. Average global temperature drop from India-Pakistan war, for example, would be about twice as large as the 1816 experience. So if you want to get an idea, you can take a look at the 1816 experience. But that's a regional nuclear war. If we took a look at a larger nuclear war, let's say a medium-scale nuclear war, let's say one that just used the high-alert weapons. In that case, of course, the situation is much worse. The clouds are much thicker, the temperature drops are much greater, and the whole thing happens much faster. And we're really talking here about a nuclear winter. And of course, it's even worse if we go all the way and use every last weapon just to show that never say die, just die. If we use the high alert weapons and the deployed arsenal, we'd get 50 to 150 million tons of smoke. The Earth would become colder than it was 18,000 years ago during the last ice age. And the growing seasons would be virtually eliminated. Most people would starve to death. And of course, many, many species of plants and animals would be in severe jeopardy. The air temperatures 3 years after that type of, this is the large number, the 150 million tons of smoke. We're talking here about 25 degrees, 15 degrees, 12.5 degrees below normal temperatures. This is really an ice age. And if you take a look at the global warming from 1880 up to about 2005, that blue line there shows the global warming, and those three colored lines at the end show the drop in temperatures that would be caused by these three scenarios. The red one is the regional nuclear war. You notice how deeply it goes down. The green one goes much, much further down. That's using only the high alert weapons and so on. So, of course, the moral of the story is that we really have to educate people about this, including politicians. People have to realize that this is not just a game of playing bluff with nuclear weapons and saying, oh, we've got a deterrent. The fact of the matter is that if these weapons exist, they are going to proliferate. They are proliferating even as we speak. And ultimately, they're going to be used. You know, sooner or later, it's going to happen. And we are really the authors of our own destruction. Here we have 4 billion years of evolution of life on Earth, which we are prepared to jeopardize in 30 minutes as a result of some kind of human conflict. Not even counting the joker in the deck of terrorism. So, I don't think we need to go on with this. We have to tell our population suicide is not a defense. And somehow, I think journalists have a responsibility when they write about nuclear weapons, nuclear proliferation, when they write about the situation in Iran, about Iran possibly developing highly enriched uranium and maybe using it for a nuclear weapon, or North Korea shooting off missiles and so on. We have a responsibility to inform people that we're the ones who have the most nuclear weapons, speaking collectively of the Western world, and the fingers that are pointing are the ones, just follow the pointed finger back to the shoulder and go down to the feet, and there's where the nuclear weapons really are. The point is that if we don't eliminate these nuclear weapons from the face of the earth, we're going to suffer the consequences, and those consequences are really grim. And enough said. Now, I don't know what's happened here. Something went wrong with that slide. What I was basically trying to say here is that we're perpetuating the threat, even though we have, many people, again, are not aware of this, but the superpowers, you know, the five permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations are all the ones that are accepted as nuclear weapon states. They are considered to be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Or are they? Not really. The USA, France, Britain, China, and what did I leave out? Huh? Russia, of course, Russia, yes. Our friends in Russia, right. Well, the thing is that they are legally obliged under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to get rid of those weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Article 6 of the treaty, when they accuse other people of possibly breaking the Non-Proliferation Treaty or violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty, who is the biggest violator of the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Those with nuclear weapons. Because Article 6 says they have an obligation. The deal is, you countries who do not have nuclear weapons promise not to get them. We who have nuclear weapons promise to get rid of them. And the World Court ruled a few years ago that this is not just someday in the distant future. It's an obligation now. It's an obligation now. And these reductions, when they talk about reducing nuclear weapons, we could probably do with fewer and so on. That's not good enough. That's like saying we can do with fewer cancer cells, but we can tolerate so many. Or maybe with slavery, we can do with fewer slaves, but we should be able to tolerate, some places should be able to have slaves. No, it's got to be zero. We have to go to zero. And we really have to, I think journalists and people and politicians all have to be reminding ourselves all the time that these temporary moves are only good if they are tokens of a determination to go all the way. If they're not, then they're just self-delusion, self-deception. Another thing I should say on this score is that, I'm sorry this slide just didn't come out, but the proliferation rationale, NATO had a meeting in May of this year, and at that meeting they reiterated their policy, this is NATO's policy, that they will be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict if conventional weapons do not suffice. They will be the first. They do not have a no first use policy. They also say that nuclear weapons are essential, quote unquote, essential for the security of the defensive alliance of NATO. In May of this year, at least they recognize that this is sending a terrible signal to the rest of the world, but they haven't changed their policy. Because basically, if it is essential for defense for NATO, why shouldn't it be essential for defense for everybody else as well? And therefore, any country in the world could say, well, NATO says it's essential for defense. Obviously, it is essential for defense. We got to have nuclear weapons. So it's just an incentive. It's fanning the fires of proliferation, not containing it. And of course, it's important to realize too, in dealing with such tricky situations, I'm just as concerned as anybody else about Iran getting a nuclear weapon because of the implications for the whole thing. But don't forget, Israel has nuclear weapons already, and they haven't promised to forego them, whatever. It's important to sort of bear in mind that nothing Iran has done is really illegal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They are, in fact, entitled to build an enrichment plant. They are entitled to enrich uranium. There's nothing that forbids that. It's just people don't trust them. Well, you know, we shouldn't trust ourselves either. You know, if these weapons are so evil that they have to be, you know, regarded almost as a work of the devil, then we shouldn't have them either. I'll also point out, of course, that we have allies, strong allies, Israel, India, Pakistan, who have developed nuclear weapons clandestinely and who are not treated as pariahs in the Western world. So the hypocrisy is evident to anybody with eyes to see. And you cannot run a world on a hypocritical double standard. You can't expect to have peace by having that kind of a strange morality, you might say. Now, at the risk of trying your patience, what's the time right now?
8:50.
I would like to go on and talk a little bit about nuclear power as well, if that's okay with you, but I'm open to your, you know, good wishes. If you'd like me to continue, I will. But I felt that, surely on the anniversary of Hiroshima, we have to address this question. We have to realize that this is really the biggest threat to the human race. It's us. You know, we've met the enemy, and it's us. Now, if we talk about, excuse me, I'll just get this launched. How does it go here? This is a graphic that was designed by a friend of mine in Saskatoon, and I like it very much. The Japanese characters stand for the word hope, I'm told. So, Fukushima. To me, Fukushima, now you see, here's a difference of perception. To the people in the nuclear industry, Fukushima is a regrettable accident that is something, oops, we have to do better. We have to clean up our act. We have to pull up our socks. We have to, you know, design the reactors better and so on. They just regard it as sort of a blip on their march towards the future. I regard it, and many other people regard it, as a devastating revelation of what nuclear power really is. Because this technology is really not a technology that we should be encouraging or embracing or spreading around. The reason why is that it's a technology which, in the process of mass producing electricity, also mass produces huge quantities of radioactive poisons, which are virtually indestructible. Why would you want to encourage an industry which mass produces some of the most toxic materials ever known to man? Yet that's what we have with nuclear power. And what happens when you have a nuclear accident is that those things get out. If they didn't get out, they would stay inside and they would be nuclear waste, and maybe they'll get out later. Maybe they'll leak out instead of being pushed out by an explosion or whatever. But those materials, we don't really know what to do with them. And that's really the problem, the number one problem with nuclear power, other than its connection with nuclear weapons. Now here's a picture of before the tsunami hit, before the earthquake. These are a picture of units 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power station. There were actually 2 other reactors as well, 5 and 6. Only 3 of these reactors were actually operating at the time. Those are 1, 2, and 3 on the left. Number 4 on the right there was in fact not operating, and in fact there was no nuclear fuel in the core of the reactor. All the fuel had been taken out of the core and had been put into what's called the spent fuel bay, or a pool of water for storage. Nevertheless, those 4 reactors all exploded. And these explosions occurred sometime after the tsunami had struck. And many people were very shocked to see these pictures, including people in the nuclear industry. And what these are hydrogen gas explosions. And the hydrogen gas explosions, well, a lot of people wondered, what is the cause of all this damage? If the earthquake didn't really damage the reactors so badly, and if the tsunami didn't damage the reactors so badly, what caused all the damage? And the answer is, the radioactive waste caused the damage. It's the radioactive waste that destroyed those reactors. And this hydrogen gas was actually caused by the overheating of the radioactive waste, leading to reaction with the steam, which was caused by the overheating as well. The steam interacted with the metal coating on the radioactive waste to produce hydrogen gas. And when they had to relieve the pressure, you know, just like a pressure cooker, you have to relieve the pressure, otherwise it's going to explode from the steam buildup, right? When they relieved the pressure by letting the steam out, they also let the radioactive materials out, and they also let the hydrogen gas out, and that's what's exploded, is the hydrogen gas. It blew the roofs off 3 of those buildings, numbers 1, 3, and 4, and there was also another explosion in Unit 2, which is a little bit more mysterious. It seemed to have taken place more in the center of the reactor. Look at the damage. That damage is entirely self-inflicted, entirely self-inflicted. Any reactor in the world would undergo this type of damage if it didn't have adequate cooling for an extended period of time. Any reactor in the world would have a similar thing, because any reactor would overheat, produce steam, produce hydrogen gas. If that hydrogen gas were to explode, this is what would happen. Here we have the overview. 1, 2, and 3 exploded. Number 4 not only exploded, even though it had no fuel in the core of the reactor, but it also had a fire in the spent fuel bay. Something which many people in the nuclear industry believe was impossible, even though nuclear critics had been for years pointing out that it was possible. And this had also been confirmed by the National Academy of Sciences. The fuel itself, when it's hot enough, can actually begin to burn with a flame. It's called a zirconium fire, because the metal on the outside is called zirconium. Now, here's a cutaway picture of the design, which is actually a General Electric design. These are actually American-type reactors. There's 43 of these reactors, 23 of these reactors still operating in the United States. The very same design. They're called the General Electric Mark I design. And if you look at the green outside shell, that's called the secondary containment. That's what was blown apart. The yellow envelope inside is called the primary containment, and that was largely intact, at least at the top. And inside that, you see that brass-colored vessel, which is actually made of stainless steel. That's the core vessel. They call it the pressure vessel, where the fuel is for the nuclear reaction. And down below we have this torus, which is called a suppression pool, for cooling the steam if steam is generated. It's a way of condensing the steam and keeping the pressure from getting out of hand. But all of it depends upon the use of pumps, and pumps depend upon the use of electricity, and if there's no electricity, there's no cooling. And you get spontaneous overheating caused by what? Caused by the radioactivity alone. It's the radioactivity of the waste that cannot be shut off. And that's a fundamental flaw with all nuclear reactors. They cannot be shut off because the radioactivity continues to generate heat for years after the plant has been completely shut down. So there's the aftermath. Now, It's caused by things called fission products. And what are these fission products? You've heard of some of them. They're cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90. You've heard of these names? Well, what are they? You know what they are? They're actually broken pieces of uranium atoms. The uranium atoms are split in order to produce energy inside the reactor, and it creates hundreds of different varieties of broken pieces. And these broken pieces are highly unstable atoms. Unstable atoms are radioactive. And those radioactive atoms are what causes the heat, and also what causes the danger to humans and to other living things. Here is a monument from Russia, a monument to the splitting of the atom. One thing about the Russians is they're really good at monuments. And who would have thought of building a monument to the splitting of the atom? But there it is. And the man in front is a man called Kurchatov. He's known as the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. And those two mighty slabs in the background symbolize the very moment when a uranium atom is being split into two pieces. The semicircles indicate or symbolize the energy that is released, 400 times as much energy as in the most violent chemical reaction. And, but you notice those two hemispheres. Those two hemispheres are the broken pieces of the uranium atom, and they are not uranium anymore. They are now new substances. One of them could be, for example, strontium-90. One of them could be, for example, cesium-137. And we have over 212 of these radioactive materials on our website listed. You can consult them. They're all little broken fragments of uranium atoms. Now, these broken pieces are also atoms, but they're highly unstable, and unstable atoms are called radioactive. And what happens with these unstable atoms is they explode, and when they explode spontaneously, they give off a part of themselves. And usually it's a particle. Notice down below we have a particle. There's an alpha particle and a beta particle. Alpha and beta emitters, they're called. Alpha emitters and beta emitters. And this is not really radiation. They use the word radiation. It's really the wrong word, because particles are not radiation. So they use radiation, and in a way it's one of those words which mystifies people because they don't understand what's being talked about. These are like little subatomic projectiles or shrapnel that goes through living tissue and causes a great deal of damage to all the organic molecules, including the DNA molecules. And that's why it's dangerous for living things. It also gives off energy in the form of a real ray, which is called a gamma ray. But not all the time. Some things give off gamma rays and some things don't. It's the gamma ray that really has penetration, that really goes through things. But the alpha and beta particle, they're relatively non-penetrating. They're mainly a problem inside the body, not so much outside the body. So what is a meltdown? Well, a meltdown is caused by the fact that the fission products produce decay heat just because of the radioactivity. They're exploding. And because they're exploding, they're producing heat. And that heat represents about almost 10% of full power heat. So if you have a nuclear reactor operating, very, very hot, right? The pumps are all churning away, electricity is being produced. If you shut that reactor down instantly or within seconds, as all the reactors were shut down, in fact, successfully at Fukushima, within seconds of the earthquake. But the problem is you can't shut off the radioactivity. If you could shut off the radioactivity, there would be no radioactive waste problem. And that radioactivity produces about 10% of full power heat, more than enough to melt the core of the reactor and to blow the reactor to kingdom come. So the decay heat can't be shut off, it has to be removed. That means pumps, that means electricity. Loss of cooling after shutdown causes rising temperatures. This is another thing that makes people confused. They think, why is this thing still hot? Can't they cool it off? It's not a question of being hot, it's a question of generating heat. So it's like, you lock a dog in a car with the windows up on a hot sunny day, and it turns into an oven because the sunlight is going into the car and the temperatures are going up and up and up. Well, in this case, there's nothing going into the core of the reactor, but there's something coming out. And that's these radioactive particles which are causing that temperatures to go up and up and up. And there's no theoretical limit as to how high the temperature could go. So when it reaches about 1800 degrees Celsius, the cladding can actually burn and release hydrogen,
Even if it doesn't burn, it can release hydrogen, by the way. It can release hydrogen around 1,000 degrees. And then when it gets hotter, it can actually catch fire. And at 2,800 degrees Celsius, the fuel itself melts. And in fact, we now know that all 3 reactors melted down, the 3 in the core of the reactors. Now, these internal hazards, I mentioned to you the alpha and the beta rays, the alpha and beta particles, are often called alpha and beta rays, but they're really particles. Those things don't have much penetrating power, but they're very dangerous inside the body. In fact, they're even more dangerous than the penetrating radiation. So the main problem for civilians is getting that stuff into your body by breathing it, by eating the food, by drinking the water, by licking your fingers, or even absorption directly through the skin. And children, of course, even tying their shoelaces, they found that children tying their shoelaces end up getting cesium on their fingers from the shoelaces, and then of course if they eat a sandwich or anything without, well, it's pretty hard to clean this stuff off. In fact, when they have accidents, they send in hundreds of workers to try and scrub the cesium off the walls, and they can't scrub it off. And eventually they have to put some kind of lead-based paint over it to try and do the best they can to shield the radiation. So this is a real problem. The main long-term hazard for civilians is the alpha and beta radiation, which is in the form of contamination. The main hazard for the workers is more direct exposure. You know those suits they wear? They don't protect them against the penetrating radiation, they protect them against the non-penetrating radiation. There's a little bit of protection from the penetrating, but not much. So the main hazard for the workers is direct exposure to gamma rays and neutrons. And of course, people outside the plant can also be irradiated with gamma rays too. This is an example of an alpha particle in lung tissue. It shows, this is the lung tissue of an ape through a microscope. It's a slide. And that little star-shaped object is really an optical illusion, because the little spikes on the star are actually tracks made over a period of 48 hours by the alpha particles that are given off by a tiny radioactive material which is so small that it's invisible. And it's giving off these alpha particles periodically. And if you left the camera lens open for another 48 hours, all you'd see is a big black blob. But at this exposure, you can see the individual. This picture was also taken by Robert Deltredici. Now, the danger to the human body is that there are hundreds of these radioactive materials, and they all have their own pathways through the environment and through the human body. So, for example, iodine-131, just like ordinary iodine, goes to the thyroid gland, and there it can cause thyroid cancer, and it can also cause various thyroid disorders, which can be very severe in young children. For example, it can cause mental retardation, it can cause stunted growth, it can cause abnormal developments in the development of the child. On the other hand, cesium-137 is chemically similar to potassium, and as such, it goes to the body to the same place where, you see, the body doesn't know these things are radioactive. The body says, oh, look, this looks like something good. It looks like potassium, so let's put it into the bloodstream and let's put it into the soft tissues, which is where the body needs potassium. And so that's where the cesium-137 goes, and that's why it contaminates the meat of animals, and the meat becomes unusable for human consumption. The strontium-90 is similar to calcium, and it goes to the bones, and there it can cause bone cancer and also leukemia and other kinds of blood diseases, because that's where the blood-forming organs are in the bone marrow. And so if you think about it that way, then you have a better understanding. Don't use, I try to avoid using the word radiation and use instead the word radioactivity, radioactive materials. You see, people get the wrong idea, and the nuclear establishment, if I might call it that, likes to give people the wrong idea. They really do. Subconsciously, they wouldn't admit that they do this deliberately, but I think that subconsciously they do it quite well. See, most of our experience with radiation, like these lights are giving off light radiation, but we have a light switch, we can turn it off. If you have an X-ray machine, you turn it off, it's harmless when you turn it off. If you have a microwave oven, you turn it off, it's harmless, right? Radioactivity cannot be turned off. There's no way of turning it off, there's no off switch. And that makes it fundamentally different. Another thing that makes it fundamentally different is how it infiltrates into all parts of the ecosystem in so many different ways because it has so many different chemical identities. So the main concepts here are the reactors can't be fully turned off, the heat can melt the core, penetrating radiation for the workers, non-penetrating radiation in the soil, the food, the water, and so on. Now, I think that I've used my time. How about if I just zip to the end? I'll skip through the nuclear waste section and just say something about the future of the nuclear industry, okay? Is that okay, or should I stop now? I don't mind stopping now. Okay, go for it. All right, this is about the refurbishment of John P2. They have to replace all these pipes, which, by the way, become permanent radioactive waste. They can never be reused for any purpose. You can't melt them down and reuse them. Everything becomes radioactive waste. It's the ultimate throwaway society. So this is all, it says even underground, the heat is being generated for 50,000 years. This is for the first 8,800 years underground. When the nuclear waste is buried, it continues to generate heat, and that heat spreads out through the rock and will not return to its normal temperatures for about 50,000 years. In Quebec, we have some policies on nuclear power that are worthwhile knowing about. First of all, Premier René Lévesque, way back in 1978, declared an indefinite moratorium on any new nuclear power plants in Quebec. And the current government has reiterated that nuclear power has no real future in this province, so it's basically a dead-end technology here. Premier Robert Bourassa, as I mentioned before, said that we'll never allow the permanent storage of nuclear waste, and the National Assembly said they wouldn't accept to be a repository for all of Canada's nuclear waste either. So what about the future of nuclear power? That's something people are very interested in. Because obviously there's going to be more nuclear reactors built, but not nearly as many as the nuclear industry would like to have built. So there are two options here. From the point of view of the nuclear industry, those options are success or failure. Success means nuclear power really catches on and we start building thousands of the suckers all over the world. Well, in that case, this is an ad called Small Wonder, and we have an actor here holding up a fuel pellet saying, "Isn't that amazing that this little pellet of uranium fuel can supply so much energy? This would be equivalent to a huge carload of coal." And of course, that's the big attraction of nuclear power. The biggest attraction is just the sheer concentration of power and energy in a very small volume. And they like to emphasize the volume because they always say the volume of the waste is also small. Well, small, but extraordinarily toxic. What it doesn't say, though, is that if this pellet had actually come out of a reactor after being used, he would be dead. Because the radioactivity of the fission products would kill him within 10 seconds. Really. So once these fuel bundles come out of the reactor, they are millions of times more radioactive when they come out than when they went in. And the reason why is because the fission products are created inside the reactor, and they are millions of times more radioactive than the uranium. Uranium itself can be handled safely with just a pair of gloves because it doesn't give off very much penetrating radiation. Out of the reactor, it's going to kill you, and everybody in this room would be killed by the time it takes me to finish this sentence. If I had a fuel bundle sitting right there on the table, we'd all be dead. So that's the problem, is what do you do with that stuff once it comes out? Now, it turns out that uranium, like oil, is not an infinite resource. It's going to give out, and the nuclear industry has always known this. And from the very beginning of the nuclear age, way back in the 1940s, they predicted that uranium will only be used as a bridging fuel because in the future we will be using another fuel called plutonium, which is actually produced from uranium, but which is produced in sufficient quantities that you could imagine using it for a long time to come. So here is this is from Chalk River, Ontario. This plaque, which has the emblem on it, is about the very first reactor that was built in Canada, which, by the way, started up 1 month after the Hiroshima bomb. And if you read the plaque, this is at the Information Center at Chalk River. If you read the plaque, it says that this reactor was originally part of an effort to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. In fact, that's what nuclear reactors were first made for. They were first made not to produce energy, but to produce plutonium for weapons, because plutonium turns out to be an even more powerful nuclear explosive than highly enriched uranium. The Nagasaki bomb was made from plutonium. There is how much plutonium is required. That is a glass paperweight that was manufactured to be the exact size and shape of the ball of plutonium in the Nagasaki bomb. That's how much plutonium it takes to destroy a city. That's about 6 kilograms. Nowadays, they can get the same explosive power using about 3 kilograms. So every nuclear reactor produces enough plutonium every year to produce about 100 nuclear weapons. So as the nuclear reactors are operating, not only are they producing electricity, not only are they producing nuclear waste, but they're also producing plutonium, which falls into a different category. And we don't know how to get rid of that either. This is how you really handle plutonium. This guy has got his bare hand, but that's because it's not plutonium, it's just a glass ball. This is how you really handle plutonium. This is in a so-called glove box. She's a worker handling plutonium. Now, plutonium is regarded as the fuel of the future because uranium is going to run out. And when uranium runs out, we're going to need the other fuel. The difficulty with using plutonium as a fuel is it means that there will be traffic in plutonium all around the world. And any of that plutonium which is hijacked by Tony Soprano or by anybody else can be used to make atomic bombs. And how can you keep anything out of the hands of criminals? Gold, can you keep that out of the hands of criminals? Heroin? Money? Diamonds? What is it that you can keep out of the hands of criminals? Nothing. Anything that is commercially traded is going to be stolen by somebody somewhere. And so the danger of using plutonium as a fuel is that it is immediately weapons usable, unlike the uranium that is used as fuel today. The uranium that's used in fuel today you cannot make a bomb with it. In the future, you will be able to make a bomb with the reactor fuel. Whew. That's a very crazy picture. This is a modern H-bomb, one of those huge weapons that are 50 times larger than the Hiroshima bomb. It uses what's called nuclear fusion. And that column down in the center there, that column is the material that creates nuclear fusion. However, you notice the black ball at the very top, the little black ball inside? That's plutonium. That plutonium ball is what starts the whole thing going. If you take the plutonium out of the bomb is useless. When they talk about dismantling nuclear weapons, what they mean is simply removing the plutonium pit, they call it a pit, out of the head of the warhead. And then the problem becomes, what do we do with them? What do we do with these pits? How do we manage those? Because at the moment, we don't know how to get rid of it. Once we've created it, it becomes a legacy, a terrible legacy. Now, this is a graphic, this is a little cartoon drawn by my friend Bob, the photographer, to illustrate that at the moment there is a firewall. I used the word firewall, and he liked the image, so he drew a firewall. There is a firewall between the bomb behind the firewall and the nuclear reactor in front of the firewall. At the present time, it is by no means easy to take material from a nuclear reactor and use it to make a bomb directly. And the reason why is because in order to produce plutonium, you have to put the fuel into the reactor, and then when it comes out, it's so damn radioactive, it's going to kill anybody who goes near it. So getting the plutonium out of the fuel is really not feasible for criminals or for low-tech people. However, in order to keep the nuclear industry going, the nuclear industry plans to eliminate the firewall and replace it with what's called a reprocessing plant. A reprocessing plant, that R stands for reprocessing. They also use the word recycling. They say, you know that we can recycle the nuclear waste? And they also use the word renaissance, the nuclear renaissance. And they all, in a sense, are equal to each other, because they all depend upon taking the irradiated fuel from the reactor. You can see a fuel bundle inside there, running it through that robotic factory where they separate the plutonium from all the rest of the radioactive garbage. Once the plutonium is separated, it can be handled relatively safely because it only gives off alpha radiation, which is only an internal hazard, not an external hazard. So you can actually smuggle this stuff So in other words, the nuclear industry itself is going to do the job that's too tough for criminals. They're going to separate the plutonium so that it's all nice and neat and packaged, ready to be stolen and used for bombs. That's what I am particularly most frightened of in terms of the future of the nuclear industry. I hope to God they don't succeed. Every country that has invested heavily in nuclear power, Russia, France, Britain, India, Japan, they have all invested in plutonium reprocessing technology because they know that that's the way of the future. Finally, what about the other option, the option of nuclear phase-out, the option where the nuclear renaissance doesn't happen? Well, that seems to be, at the moment, a very distinct possibility. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, even going back, this is a report that was given back in 2007, way before Fukushima. And they pointed out that nuclear power accounted for 16% of electricity supply worldwide in 2005, which was the base year they were using. And they could raise the 16% to 18%. That's a pretty small increase in a quarter of a century. So in 25 years, if you really work hard, you can get the share up from 16% to 18%. In fact, the share has gone down from 14%, and the latest figures I heard is it's now down to 13%. So it's actually going down, not up. And they mentioned, of course, the important point to recognize here, and this is very important, is that contrary to many people's beliefs, nuclear power cannot possibly solve the climate change problem. There's no way on earth it can solve the climate change problem. My contention is the problems it poses are far greater than any advantages it offers. If we look at renewable electricity, it already accounted for 18% of electricity supply in 2005 and could easily grow to 30 to 35% in the same 25-year period. So in other words, renewables are much better than nuclear in terms of... here's what's happening in Canada. We have less nuclear power in Canada now, significantly less, than we had 10 or 20 years ago, because we're shutting plants down, but we're not having new ones being built. For example, at Pickering, they tried to refurbish the first 4 reactors, the ones in the foreground there, and they found that it was impossible. The ones that they refurbished are number 1 and number 4, and number 2 and 3 they've shut down permanently because they've given up on them. They just can't get them refurbished. So there's half the power gone from those 4 reactors. And even the 2 that are running are not running very well. They're only running at about half capacity as well. They also have decided since then not to bother refurbishing the other 4. So within the next 10 years, the other 4 are going to be permanently shut down as well. That means that there's only going to be 2 out of the 8 reactors that will be operating in 10 years' time. And if we go through the other sites in Ontario, the Bruce reactors, we also find that there's been cancellations of new reactors that have been planned and just been canceled. There's been delays in refurbishing, vast cost overruns, and also experience that shows that these refurbished reactors don't operate as well as they're supposed to. They're not like new reactors. They're like old reactors that have only got a facelift. The Darlington site, there's accelerated aging evident there. 2 new reactors at Darlington have been promised by the Ontario government. They have said that this is a commitment, but they have been postponed, and we don't know if they'll ever see the light of day, or if so, how much they'll cost, because the cost has been phenomenal. So anyway, I think I'll just close up by saying that here's a report from Switzerland saying the worldwide renaissance of nuclear power, so often predicted, will not take place in the next few decades. Nuclear energy will be on the decline until the year 2030 and will continue to decline in importance globally. Please notice that that was a year before Fukushima. This is also before Fukushima. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission said the U.S. doesn't need any new nuclear or coal-fired plants for that matter. It could make do with renewable energy and natural gas. This guy is the guy who's in charge of the top regulator for the U.S. energy field. Fortune magazine, always interested in making $1 million or $1 billion or $1 trillion, had a panel, and the panel said that don't expect more than 3 new nuclear plants to be built in the United States in the next 10 years. 3. Well, this is hardly a nuclear renaissance. In fact, I jokingly sometimes say that the reason the nuclear industry maybe talks so much about a nuclear renaissance is because they're operating in the dark ages. At any rate, even the 54 reactors in Japan, 54 reactors in Japan, representing 30% of that country's electrical power, as of September 2011, there were only 11 of those 54 reactors still operating. And of course, as of June of this year, there were 0. And now there have been 2 reactors opened up. So we now have 2 out of 54 operating, and the federal government is wanting to open more. But there's hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets saying they don't want it. They don't want it. So we're really seeing, I think, a sea change. Of course, we know that Germany shut down 8 reactors immediately and permanently, and that all 17 of their reactors are shut down by 2022. Japan has said, though, it won't be any more new reactors, although they do want to open up the old ones. And the new energy policy will be based on renewables. Switzerland has said no more reactors. China they're going ahead. But they're going ahead cautiously, and many people vastly overestimate how many reactors are planned for China. There are new reactors planned for China, but it represents a very small fraction, less than 3% of their electricity. And they're going much faster on renewables than they are on nuclear. But they are still going ahead on nuclear. Italy had a referendum strongly rejecting nuclear power. Belgium has said they're going to do a complete phase-out. So I think that what we're seeing here is even the Siemens industry, the big nuclear firm, has said it's getting out of the nuclear field completely. And it's not only because Germany has phased out nuclear, but because they've done international business all over the world. But the chairman, the CEO of Siemens Corporation said that we believe that the future and the big engineering challenge of the future is renewable energy, not nuclear. Thank you.